After 2 years as an experimental feature, partial pre-rendering is now finally stable in Next.js 16, and that's what we're covering in this video. I'm assuming you've already seen the release notes for Next.js 16, so we're not going to rehash everything here, but instead, we'll focus on what actually matters to your day-to-day development. We'll also have more videos coming on practical patterns using the new caching architecture, best practices, and performance optimizations in Next.js 16. Now, performance has been the driver behind partial pre-rendering. The question is, how do you get dynamic functionality that depends on request time data at the speed of static? Let's quickly recap the trade-offs. Static rendering happens at build time. It's blazing fast. You're just serving pre-rendered assets from a CDN, but you have zero personalization because you don't know who the user is. In contrast, dynamic rendering happens at request time. Now you know who the user is and can personalize everything. But the trade-off is latency. You have to wait for the server to render and respond. Partial pre-rendering combines both. You serve a static shell instantly, then stream in the dynamic parts during the same request. Best of both worlds. But how does it work? Previously, Next.js was all or nothing at the route level. Your entire page was either static or dynamic. But think about it. Even on a dynamic page, most of it is actually static. Your header, footer, layouts, they never change. Only specific parts need request data. So why render the static parts at runtime? Partial pre-rendering solves this. It serves the static shell with holes or placeholders in it, then streams the dynamic part at request time. This is built on React's concurrency, suspense, and streaming APIs. I'll link a technical deep dive in the description. Now, here's where it gets interesting. How does Next.js know which part of your page are static versus dynamic? The old way was messy. Cache no store in fetch options, route segment configs like export const dynamic force dynamic, the unstable no store function, or if you used cookies and headers, would turn the whole page into dynamic. But the new way? Promises. In Next.js 15, if you remember last year, all request APIs became asynchronous. Cookies, headers, search params, route parameters, they all now return promises. That's the signal. If it is async, Next.js knows it's potentially dynamic. In Next.js 16, when you access any async operation, you get an error. There's suspense. Is it dynamic or should I cache it? You decide. Async operations include database queries, request APIs, but Next.js is even smart to know that functions like newDate or math.random generate new values and gives you the same option to either render them statically or dynamically. Now, when working with promises and async operations, we've been using Suspense in previous versions of Next.js and React to render a loading skeleton while the asynchronous task is being executed. The other part of this partial pre-rendering is the new use cache directive. But how would you go about using these two new directives together? Well, first, you need to enable it. It's opt-in. You need to add cache components through to your Next config. Then you would have these two new tools to use. For dynamic parts, use Suspense. Wrap async components in React Suspense boundary. Now, using this, the fallback UI is going to render in your static shell at build time. At request time, the dynamic part renders and swaps in. For cached parts, you could use the new use cache directive. Sometimes your asynchronous code barely changes. You're fetching from a database, but the data updates only maybe once a day. You want to cache it statically. Add use cache at the top of your file to your page component or even a function. It tells Next.js, yes, this is asynchronous, but cache it and render it statically. The only caveat, requests as specific APIs like cookies, headers, and search params can't be cached. They need request data that doesn't exist at build time. For those, you must use Suspense. Now, why is this better? Well, the old way was confusing. Fetch options here, route configs there, different approaches for different scenarios, all or nothing, all at the route level. Now it's simple and component-based. Async needs request data, use Suspense. Async, but can be cached, use the new cache directive. You could also get the same cache control functions as before for revalidation, cache tagging, updating your tag, and whatnot. Before we jump into a project and see all of this in action, I want to mention 3 more things that stood out to me in the Next.js 16 release. The first one is Next.js DevTools MCP. If you're using coding agents, you know the pain. You ask about Next.js features, but you get outdated answers. The new Next.js DevTools MCP fixes this. It gives your AI agent up-to-date documentation access, migration tools for the cache components, but also direct access to your Next.js 16's MCP server that runs simultaneously as an endpoint when you run local dev server to get runtime access to logs, errors, and insights. Now, the second thing I'm excited about is platform adapters. This is going to help you deploy your Next.js app to platforms other than Vercel. You want to self-host it or use Cloudflare workers, there's an adapter for it. This is about making Next.js truly open source, so you could deploy it anywhere with the same functionality. It's still in alpha, but I'm excited to cover this when it matures. Third and last thing is the new React DevTools Suspense tab. Great for debugging, but it also helps seeing the dynamic parts of your page, and you can trigger or toggle the suspense boundary into its loading state while you're designing your loading skeleton. Let's now jump into a project and see all of this in action. I've built a simple e-commerce app for this demo. Right now, it's vanilla Next.js. No partial pre-rendering, no cache components. We have some category pages that render some product-specific pages, and also one categories page. Let's jump into our code editor and have a look at our project from a high level. We have this root layout where we are rendering our HTML and body tags. I'm wrapping everything inside of my site as a pattern to share different layouts for different pages of your application. So I have my homepage over here. On the homepage, I'm getting the categories and my feature products, as you can see here, and I'm rendering them in these sections. Now, before turning on cache components, I want to run a build command and see how it turns out as it is right now. So inside my terminal, I'm going to run bun run build. Now, this is going to create a production-ready version of our application, but most importantly, here we could see our pages. Now, we have this empty circle for static pages and F for dynamic pages. You can see right now we only have static or dynamic pages inside of our app. The category slug and the product ID, because they require slug or dynamic params, are rendered dynamically. I have not included a generate static params function, so it's dynamic, and the rest are static. There's no partial pre-rendering. Now let's go back to our app. Let's go to our next config and enable cache components. So I'm going to set this to true and save this up. Now let's go to our application, and without even refreshing, I can see our first issue. Now this is saying that we're using the new date function before accessing any dynamic data, as I mentioned in the beginning, and this conflicts with Next.js's partial pre-rendering. We have 2 options. So there is a link here in the documentation that you can read more about this. So date.now, date or new date, before on-cache data or dynamic data or request data, which is request APIs, cookies, headers, and whatnot, causes an error. Possible ways to fix it. There's 3 ways you can fix this. 1, if this is for logging purposes, you could use the performance.now function instead. 2nd, if current time is appropriate to be pre-rendered or cached, you could use the use cache. And if this needs to be dynamic and it's for display purposes, you could move it to a client component. Let's go back to our app. Let's close this off, open up our footer, and let's use the Next DevTools MCP to see if we can figure out this problem. So I'm going to say Next DevTools, what are the errors in my Next.js application? Now this is going to init the Next DevTools, and it's going to ask you to initialize that tool, access the different functions or tool calls that it has. You can also add it to your allow list so it doesn't ask you every time. As you can see, it ran the get errors tool name it detected that we have a problem inside of our footer, and it is recommending for us the three options we have: to use the use client, use cache, or access this data after a dynamic data first. Now I'm going to ask it to use a use client component. Let's move the year into a client component. So it is successfully creating a new current year component and is going to replace it with down here where we have the new date. But there's going to be another problem here too, because Next.js would want this new client component to be wrapped also in a suspense. And let's see if it picks that up as well. So we're going to run this tool again to see if there's any errors. And there you go. It picked up on that. It wrapped it with a suspense as well. So we're going to run. It checks after every implementation. It also checks to see if there's any errors before it completes the work. You can see here it says the suspense boundary is required because Next.js 16 pre-renders pages and needs to know where dynamic content, like the current date, will be inserted at runtime. So let's go ahead and keep everything here. Let's go back to the home page and refresh. And now we're seeing another error. Now this error is no longer for our footer component, instead is for our fetch. So going back to our home page now, you can see here we are accessing categories by using fetch. Now we can either use the use cache directive and mark this with a cache life of weeks if this data doesn't change that often, or we can mark it as dynamic, wrap it with a suspense boundary, and ask Next.js to always render this as a dynamic part. Now, instead of solving this ourselves, I want to just plug in this into Next.js DevTools again and see what happens. Again, I'm going to say next DevTools. What are the errors on my Next.js application? Now, this should read this specific error that we're getting on the home page right now. So let's see if it can figure it out. Let's init the tool. Yeah, as you can see, it is detected that on the home page, we're running the getCategories function and it's uncached, and we need to decide how we want to fix it. Either wrapping it with a suspense or use the use cache directive. Now let's keep these changes and let's instruct it to use the use cache directive. So let's use cache for the categories, since they won't change that often, and use dynamic rendering for the featured products. So I'm telling it that for the featured products, maybe I just want to refresh these or dynamically render these because I want to have most up-to-date featured products on every request, but my categories won't change that often, so I will just render them as static. Now, as you can see, it has added the use cache directive to the getCategories function, but it has created the featured products section so we can wrap it in a suspense boundary and a skeleton so that we could use it inside of our suspense fallback. Let's keep this. Let's go back to our app and refresh our page, and we shouldn't see any errors over here. Let's just scroll down to our categories. This is the static part of our app, but when we go to the featured products, which is this section, it should show a loading skeleton to us. Now that we're here, let's also see this React DevTools suspense that I was telling you about. So the suspense tab, now it's showing our homepage. This is our entire homepage. And the dynamic part of it is marked with this green component. So when I hover over it, it just shows you the dynamic part of your application. Now, if I want to go on here and actually trigger the suspense or the loading state for this feature products, this is showing me the loading skeleton. You could use it to debug. So this is what the users will see when the dynamic data is streaming in. But everything else on your page is a static. And that's partial pre-rendering in action. So you have the static shell of anything that can be generated at build time, plus a section, a placeholder, a fallback for the dynamic part, which is the featured products, that's going to be streamed in at request time. You can then toggle between the two states to make sure you don't have cumulative layout shift or debug your suspense boundary. Now, let's actually go ahead and visit one of our category pages as well. So inside of our category pages, if I refresh, I'm going to see another similar problem. So let's go to our categories slug page. So that's category slug. And similarly, we are getting products this time. So we have to decide. It's an asynchronous function. Next.js is going to yell at us. Is this a function that I need to cache, or do you want to dynamically render this at all times? Plus, we're going to have the dynamic params on this page, which we also need to decide about. We either have to pass in a generate static params for all the possible categories that we need to be cached or generated at build time, or we need to tell it to dynamically render every page. So let's ask our dev tool again. So next, dev tool, what are the errors in my Next.js app? Now, because Next.js is running an MCP endpoint, this dev tool now has access to runtime data. That's why it technically sees this same error that we are seeing here. So again, it is telling us on the category page, we have a problem. We have to either use cache or wrap it in a suspense. So let's use cache with the generate static params function to generate all the possible values. Let's also add a cache life of weeks. You can also pass specific values for your stale and expiry time, but the cache life also has this new cache profiles, days, minutes, weeks, and whatnot, that just defines how long you want this cache to live and when do you want it to expire and be regenerated. Let me allow this tool call as well. We're going to cover the cache life and the cache tag and the update tag functions in a future video. But for now, we're just going to use this. It ran again, made sure that we don't have any problems. Let's keep all and see what has happened here. So inside of our category page, we have the use cache directive with the cache life of week. And we also have this generate static params generating all the possible categories at build time. So this category page is basically cached for a week. Now going back to our application, if we refresh, we shouldn't have any other error. So we took care of the all categories page as well as a category slug or dynamic page. Now let's go to the product page and refresh. We should have errors here as well. Again, deciding about whether or not we want to cache this page or dynamically render because we're accessing an asynchronous data fetching function over here. So let's complete the same pattern again. Next, dev tools. What are the errors in my app? In the meantime, let's just go ahead and open up that product ID page. This is the page that's currently throwing the error. And it's apparent because we are fetching products on this page. We're also accessing asynchronous params. This is our dynamic params because the product is living inside of this ID page. And we have to decide whether or not we want to render this statically or dynamically. For our product page, I want to render it dynamically because our stock may change, our prices may change. I don't want to render this statically, so I want this page to be dynamic. Let's allow this run tools. Again, it picked up that there is a problem inside of our product ID page and asked us what do we want to do. So let's use dynamic rendering for our product page. Now, this should be similar to our feature product dynamic section where it is going to extract our product content into its own component that can then be wrapped with Suspense and also add a product skeleton so that we could pass it as a fallback UI to our Suspense boundary. So we've already seen this in action, but just so we complete our application end-to-end using partial pre-rendering so that we can run the build command and actually see this mixed partial pre-rendering pages inside of our build. All right, so as you can see, it has created a product details skeleton and product details component, then wraps that inside of our page component with a Suspense and fallback UI. This allows dynamic rendering, streaming, and better UX because it's now not blocking our entire page. It still renders a static shell leaving room for our product page or product data to just stream in at request time. So let's keep all. We visit the product page and refresh. We're still seeing another error. Let's see what this is. Well, this time it is telling us that we are accessing Params object, another asynchronous await here, without specifying what needs to happen with this guy. Is it going to be cached or is it dynamic? Going back to our page, we are awaiting the Params object. This is another asynchronous operation that we need to decide about. In this case, we are rendering the product page dynamically, so we need to move this params into the product detail component, which is now wrapped in a suspense, and we'll get rid of the error. Or if this page was supposed to be rendered statically, we would then use the use cache directive over here as well. So, but this doesn't make sense since we are rendering this or intending to render this dynamically. I'm going to ask for another change over here. So next, dev tools. What's the error in my app? And as you can see, it's picking up on the issue. The await param happens outside of the suspense boundary, and it is correctly moving it inside of our product details component that's already wrapped with our suspense. So let's run. This is going to make sure that there's no errors left. Let's keep all. So after the fix, we're just moving that inside of our page. So what are we doing? We're just getting the params right now in the page component, passing it down without awaiting it to our product details. Inside of our product details, we then await this and get our product. Now, this is a dynamic part of our application wrapped with a suspense boundary, and this is going to solve the problem. So refreshing this, no errors. And just to show you this inside of our dev tools again, inside of our suspense, we can see this section right now is entirely a dynamic page. Our header and our footer are going to be outside of this. And if I trigger this, you can see the loading skeleton for the product page. The header and the footer are there, but the only thing dynamically streaming in is now this component. We can be as granular as we want here. Maybe you don't want to dynamically render product details such as name and this description. Maybe the only thing you want to dynamically render is the stock. You could just go down more granular in that specific function that fetches this stock and only render this dynamically. So the point being that this is no longer a dynamic versus static decision at a route level. You can mix and match these two in your pages at component level or even your functions. Now that we have all of our pages taken care of, let's go back to our terminal and run the bun run build as the last part so we see the output of our production ready application. There is another error here. One last page that we forgot about taking care of is the / categories or all categories page. So let's go in here and all categories. We're also fetching data over here. So we need to decide what we want to do here. So let's use the use cache and a cache life of Wix for this page as well. Let's also import that. And this should be enough because our category pages won't change that often. So I'm happy with caching it and changing it or refreshing it weekly. So let's go back to our terminal, clear this out, and run the build command again. This time it should go through. And as you can see here now, instead of static and dynamic, now we have a new kind of page, which is called partial pre-render. Some pages are static and some pages are now partially pre-rendered, which means they have static shells and dynamic holes that will be filled in, streamed in at request time. I hope this was helpful. We're going to have more Next.js 16 specific videos coming out, so stay tuned. In the next one, we're going to add authentication to our e-commerce store and a cart feature functionality to see those dynamic features laid out inside of our application. If you have any questions, like always, hit me up down in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.